My sister stood in the kitchen and told me our mother's last words were, "Give everything to Diane." 6 hours later, I restored a backup and found 41 voice memos my mother had left on a phone Diane thought had died with her. I remember exactly where I was standing when Diane said it. Not near the stove, not near the table. Right in the doorway, like she wanted an exit already planned. She had her arms crossed the way she does when she's decided something is true before she's finished saying it. Everything to Diane. 3 words. No lawyer in the room. No witness but her. I didn't argue. I want you to understand that about me before anything else. I don't argue in kitchens. I sat with it. I nodded. I said something forgettable, and I drove home in the dark with my hands steady on the wheel and my chest doing something that wasn't steady at all. It wasn't until I was home, in the quiet of my apartment, staring at a drawer I hadn't opened since the funeral, that I remembered the old phone. Cracked screen. Dead battery. My mother's phone, the one Diane had taken off the nightstand the week our mother died and never mentioned again. I plugged it in. I didn't expect it to turn on. I definitely didn't expect what was waiting for me in the cloud once it did. 41 voice memos. Recorded over 6 weeks? My mother's voice. Tired, sometimes slurred, sometimes clear as a bell, saying things that did not match a single word my sister had told our family. But let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Marin Cole. I'm 36 years old and I recover things other people think are gone forever. That's the simplest way to explain my job. I run a small data recovery lab out of a converted storefront, the kind of place people come to with a shattered laptop and a look of pure grief on their face. Because what they lost wasn't just data, it was a wedding video, a voicemail from a father who died the next week, 4 years of a daughter's childhood photos that lived only on one drive. I've built a career out of understanding that a deleted file is rarely actually gone. It's just hidden from people who don't know where to look. My apartment smells like coffee most mornings, dark roast, the same brand for 11 years, because my mother, Ruth, bought me a bag of it as a joke gift once and I never switched. There's a photo on my fridge of the 2 of us at a lake when I was 9, her laughing so hard her eyes are shut, my hair a wet mess from jumping off a dock I wasn't supposed to jump off. I keep it there because her laugh in that photo is exactly the laugh I heard on the phone every single Sunday of my adult life. Sundays were ours. 10 in the morning, her time. She'd have the radio on in the background, the same oldies station she'd listened to since I was in grade school. And she'd tell me about her garden, her neighbor's dog, whatever book she was pretending to read but had actually given up on by chapter 3. I'd tell her about work, about the strange and heartbreaking things people brought into my lab. She liked the redemption stories best. "Tell me about the one where you found it," she'd say. "Not the one where you couldn't." My mother had a specific way of folding laundry, precise corners like she was wrapping a gift instead of putting away towels, and on video calls she'd fold while we talked. The phone propped against a cereal box on the counter. She wore the same cardigan most Sunday mornings, a faded green one with a small burn mark on the cuff from a stove incident she refused to explain in full. She was disorganized in almost every other way. Sticky notes covering the fridge like wallpaper, reminders to herself in handwriting that got looser every year. But laundry, she folded like a soldier. I am not like her in that particular way. I triple-check everything. It's a professional habit that bled into my whole life. I back up my backups. I keep receipts for purchases I'll never need to return. I have more than once made a friend laugh by pulling out a folder, an actual physical folder, labeled with a date, just to prove a point in an argument neither of us really needed to win. My sister Diane is 5 years older than me, and for most of my life that gap felt like a canyon. She left home at 18. I was 13, and suddenly an only child in a house that used to have 2 kids' worth of noise in it. She married young, divorced once, remarried a man named Gary who sells commercial real estate and talks about EBITDA at Thanksgiving. Diane and I were never close in the way people mean when they say close, but we were civil, functional. We showed up for each other at the surface level a family requires. I didn't know back then that surface level was the only level Diane had ever offered anyone. I should tell you more about my mother. Because I think you need to know her the way I knew her before you hear what was almost taken from both of us. Ruth Cole taught third grade for 26 years before she retired, and she never quite lost the habit of narrating things the way she used to narrate a lesson. Now watch this part closely. Sweetheart. Even when she was just showing me how to pit a peach or fold a fitted sheet. Her house smelled like cinnamon and old paperbacks, a specific mix I've never encountered anywhere else, and I used to tease her that she could bottle it and sell it to lonely adult children everywhere. She had a voice that people described, more than once at her funeral, as unmistakable, warm, a little raspy from decades of chalk dust and coffee, the kind of voice that made strangers in grocery store lines feel like old friends within 30 seconds. She called me sweetheart. So often it stopped being a word and became something closer to a second name. When I was sick as a kid, she'd sit at the edge of my bed reading the same 3 chapters of the same battered paperback until I fell asleep, not because the plot mattered, but because she said the sound of a familiar voice was its own kind of medicine. Even after I moved out, even after I built a whole separate adult life 90 minutes away, those Sunday morning calls kept us stitched together in a way I didn't fully appreciate until I was in danger of losing them. 11 years of Sundays. I could probably count them if I tried, and some strange grief-shaped part of me has actually considered doing exactly that. My mother's decline started slowly, the way these things do when you're not looking for them. A missed word here. A pot left on the stove there. Then, in March, a diagnosis that turned every Sunday call into something I dreaded and cherished in the same breath. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis where doctors use the word comfort instead of the word cure. I remember the exact date, March 14th. I remember because I wrote it on a sticky note of my own, the first one I'd ever put on my fridge, right next to her photo. Not because I needed reminding, because some part of me needed it written down, made real, made documented. Which, looking back, might have been the first sign of the instinct that would end up saving everything. For the first 2 weeks after the diagnosis, things were almost normal. Ruth stayed in her own house. I drove the 90 minutes every weekend instead of calling. Diane, who lived 20 minutes from our mother, started going by more often too, and for a while I was grateful. I remember thinking, good, we're going to get through this together. I had no idea how wrong that thought was. The first sign something was wrong came in April, and it was small enough that I almost let it go. Ruth had been moved into a hospice facility 2 weeks earlier, a decision Diane had made the arrangements for. Efficiently, almost proudly, the way she'd always liked being the one who handled things. I'd agreed it made sense. Ruth needed round-the-clock care neither of us could provide alone. What I didn't expect was the phone call I got from the front desk on a Tuesday afternoon, asking politely whether I was on the approved visitor list. I wasn't. There must be a mistake, I told the woman on the phone. I'm her daughter. I understand, she said, in the careful voice of someone trained not to get pulled into family conflict. The list on file just has one name currently listed as primary contact and approved visitor. A Diane Reyes, I called Diane immediately. She picked up on the second ring. Breezy, already halfway to an explanation before I'd finished the question. Mom's exhausted, Marin. The doctor said limiting visitors right now is best for her stress levels. I didn't think it needed to be a whole conversation. I just filled out the form when I did the intake paperwork. I'll add you, obviously. It sounded reasonable. It sounded, in fact, exactly like something a responsible daughter would say. I told myself that. She's just handling things. She's always been the one who handles things. I was added to the list within the hour. I chalked it up to a paperwork oversight and drove up that weekend like always. And when I saw my mother, thinner than 2 weeks before but still herself, still asking about my lab and my Sunday coffee, I let the front desk moment fade into the background of my mind. I'm probably overreacting, I told myself. Diane's under a lot of stress, too. The second sign was harder to explain away. I'd been trying to reach Ruth directly for 3 days in May, and getting nothing. Not a missed call back, not a text, nothing. Which wasn't like her, even sick, even tired. She always managed at least a voice message, some version of "Sorry, sweetheart, resting, call you tomorrow." When I finally got Diane on the phone, she told me our mother's phone had died and she hadn't had a chance to bring the charger. Fine. Reasonable? Even, except that when I visited that weekend, I noticed the charger sitting in plain sight on the nightstand. Plugged into the wall, phone nowhere near it. "Where's Mom's phone?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "I've been keeping it at my place," Diane said. "Charging it overnight, bringing it back in the morning. It's easier than hauling a charger back and forth." It was a strange answer. It was also, on its face, not an unreasonable one. I remember standing in that hospice room, looking at an empty spot on a nightstand and thinking, why does this feel wrong when nothing about it is actually wrong? I didn't push. I told myself I was tired, that grief makes people see conspiracies and coincidences, that Diane had never given me a real reason to distrust her before. And one small inconsistency about a phone charger wasn't going to be the thing that broke our fragile family truce. I'm probably overreacting, I thought again. It was becoming a familiar sentence. I want to describe what that weekend visit actually looked like, because the detail matters. My mother was propped up in the hospice bed, thinner than the photo on my fridge but still recognizably herself, and when I asked her gently whether she'd been able to call anyone that week, she frowned in a way that seemed to cost her something. "I've been trying to reach you," she said, her voice thin. "I don't understand why the line keeps saying you're busy. I haven't gotten any missed calls." "Mom," I told her, and I remember the small, cold feeling that moved through me when she looked genuinely confused by that, not comforted. "Diane's been dialing for me," she said. My hands get shaky. She holds the phone. I filed that away too, the same way I'd filed away the empty spot on the nightstand. Two small, explainable things. I didn't yet have a third. The third sign was the one I couldn't explain away, no matter how hard I tried. It was the first week of June. I'd driven up on a Wednesday, unannounced, because I'd had a cancellation at the lab and wanted to surprise my mother with an afternoon visit. When I walked into the hospice room, there was a man I didn't recognize sitting at the small table by the window, a leather folio open in front of him, papers spread out, a state seal stamped in the corner of the top page. Diane was standing beside him. My mother was in the bed, eyes half open, her hand being guided, physically guided, Diane's fingers wrapped around hers, toward a signature line. "What is this?" I asked, and my voice came out sharper than I meant it to. The man introduced himself as a notary. Diane explained quickly, calmly, that their mother was updating some paperwork. "Just a formality, Marin. Don't make this weird." And that I'd arrived at an inconvenient moment, but everything was under control. I looked at my mother. Her eyes were unfocused. Her hand, when Diane let go of it, dropped limp against the blanket. "She's medicated," I said. "She can barely hold her head up. She shouldn't be signing anything right now." "She's fine," Diane snapped, the first real edge I'd heard in her voice in weeks. "This is exactly the kind of overreacting I'm talking about. Mom wants this handled while she still can. Don't make her final weeks about you being suspicious." The notary, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. But he didn't stop. He collected the signed page, thanked Diane, and left with the quiet efficiency of a man who did not want to be in the middle of a family disagreement. I stood in that room afterward, staring at my mother's slack hand on the blanket, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't yet have a name for. I told myself one more time, maybe I'm overreacting. But some part of me, the part that spends every working day proving that nothing digital ever truly disappears, filed that moment away and refused to let it go. I didn't know yet what document had been signed. I only knew, with a certainty I couldn't fully justify out loud, that whatever had just happened in that room was not something my mother would have chosen with a clear mind. Diane made her first list 2 weeks later, and I want to describe it exactly the way it happened, because I've turned this memory over so many times since that it's carved permanent grooves in my mind. We were at Diane's house for what she called a family check-in, a phrase she'd started using that made everything sound like an HR meeting instead of a conversation between two grieving sisters. She had a legal pad on the coffee table. On it, in her handwriting, was a list titled, Mom's Wishes. A watch. $6,200, an appraisal number Diane had apparently already gotten. A down payment toward a car for Diane's son, $18,000. And at the bottom, underlined twice, the house. Mom's been telling me these things for weeks, Diane said, sliding the pad toward me like she was doing me a favor by sharing it. I wanted you to see it before anything's official. I don't want you to feel blindsided. I looked at the number next to the watch. $6,200 is an oddly specific figure for a woman who, 3 months ago, couldn't remember where she'd put her reading glasses without a sticky note reminder. Did Mom tell you this herself? I asked. Recently? When she was clear? She's been very clear with me, Diane said, and there was something in the way she said, me, a small deliberate weight on the word, that made the hair on my arms rise. I'm the one who's actually been there, Maren. I'm the one who sees her every day. You come up on weekends and think you know what's happening, but you don't. That was the trap, though I didn't have the word for it yet. If I pushed back, I was the cold, suspicious sister making her dying mother's final weeks about money. If I stayed quiet, I was agreeing to a version of events built entirely on Diane's word, delivered from a room I wasn't allowed unsupervised access to. I said something non-committal. I drove home that night with the legal pad's numbers looping in my head. 6,200, 18,000, the house, and a growing, nauseating sense that I was watching something happen to my mother that my mother had no real say in. What struck me most, replaying that evening later, was how the list had grown. Diane mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she'd first brought up the watch back in April. A small thing, sentimental, easy to agree to. By May, it had become the car down payment, framed as something our mother had always meant to do for her grandson's milestone birthday. By June, it was the house itself, no longer framed as a request at all, just a fact already decided, something for me to be informed of rather than asked about. Each addition came wrapped in the same phrase, Mom's been very clear with me, as though repetition alone could make it true. And each time, refusing to simply nod along would have made me the sister fighting over money while their mother lay dying, which was precisely the shape of trap I'd come to recognize too late in other moments and would recognize again, months later, as exactly the mechanism Diane had been building the entire time. Maybe she really did want this, I told myself, lying awake at 2 a.m. Maybe I'm the one being unfair, questioning every single thing Diane does just because she's always been the one in control. I want to be honest about how long I let that doubt sit in me. Weeks. It sat there and rotted quietly while my mother got sicker and my sister got somehow more confident. The escalation didn't stop with the list. 2 weeks after that conversation, I learned, not from Diane, but from an extended cousin at a family barbecue I almost didn't attend, that the full estate had been re-signed over to Diane during a short hospital admission, a stay I hadn't even been told about until it was already over. I thought you knew, the cousin said, uncomfortable, realizing halfway through the sentence that she'd said something she shouldn't have. Diane said Mom wanted it done quickly before things got worse. There was a whole new document, power of attorney, and then the will update after. I remember standing there in someone's backyard, a paper plate of potato salad going warm in my hand, feeling the ground tilt slightly under my feet. A hospital stay I wasn't told about, a signing I wasn't present for, a version of my mother's wishes I was only ever getting secondhand, filtered through the one person who benefited most from how those wishes were phrased. When I confronted Diane about the hospital stay, she was ready for the question, the way she seemed ready for every question by then. She was disoriented, Maren. It wasn't a big event. I didn't want to worry you over nothing. The doctors were monitoring her. It was routine. Routine enough that you got her to sign estate paperwork in the middle of it? She wanted it handled. I was just making sure her wishes were respected while she still had the chance to say them. I didn't have proof yet. I only had a stack of moments that individually could each be explained away, and collectively felt like watching a door slowly, deliberately, being closed in my face. Other relatives, when I mentioned my unease, mostly sided with Diane without knowing it. "She's always been the one who handles things," an aunt told me, not unkindly. "You know how Diane is. Efficient. Try not to make this harder than it has to be, Marin. Not with your mother so sick." I remember hanging up that call and sitting very still in my apartment, my coffee gone cold on the counter, thinking, maybe that's true. Maybe I'm the problem here. Maybe grief is making me paranoid about a sister who's simply doing what needs to be done. I let that doubt win for longer than I'm proud of. It's the part of this story I find hardest to say out loud, even now, that for weeks, I nearly let my sister's version of events become the only version that existed, simply because she said it with more confidence than I could argue against. My mother died on a Tuesday in early July at 4:52 in the morning, with Diane at her bedside and me 40 minutes away, having left the facility only 3 hours earlier because Diane had told me, gently, that visiting hours were about to end, and Ruth needed her rest. I will never know if that was true. I will never know if my mother was awake in those final hours and asking where I was. I found out later she had been. The funeral was small, tasteful, exactly the kind of service my mother would have wanted. Her favorite hymn. A slideshow of photos I helped compile, more of Diane's friends in attendance than mine, which felt right at the time because Diane had always been the more social one. I stood at the reception afterward, accepting condolences, feeling strangely hollow, like grief hadn't fully arrived yet, because there'd been too much strange tension in the months leading up to it to process the loss cleanly. Diane found me near the coat rack as people were leaving. She had that particular look she gets, soft eyes, a slight downward tilt of her head, that I used to read as grief and had started somewhere in the last 6 weeks to read as performance. "I need to tell you something," she said. Mom's last words to me were about the estate. She wanted everything to go to me. She said it clearly, Marin. I know this isn't easy to hear, but I think you deserve to know the truth instead of finding out from a lawyer. Everything to me. 3 words. Delivered in a kitchen doorway an hour after the reception ended, with her arms crossed and an exit already planned. I didn't argue. I've told you that already. I nodded, said something forgettable, and drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my chest doing something that wasn't steady at all. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I'd put my mother's old phone the week she died. Cracked screen, dead battery, taken from Diane's house almost as an afterthought when I helped pack up some of Ruth's remaining things. I plugged it in without any real plan. I told myself I just wanted to see her lock screen photo one more time. Us at the lake. That laugh. It powered on. The battery icon blinked red, then steadied. And an old habit. The professional instinct I've built a career on. The one that says, nothing digital is ever really gone. Made me open the settings menu and check the iCloud backup status instead of just looking at the photo. Last backup, June 28th, 11:47 p.m., 9 days before she died. My hands went cold. I sat down on the floor of my apartment, back against the cabinet, and started restoring the backup onto an old tablet I use for lab testing. Because I didn't trust myself to do it carefully enough on my own phone. The progress bar took 11 minutes. I remember watching it the way you watch something you're both desperate for and terrified of. When it finished, I opened the voice memos app out of habit. It's usually the last place people think to check, which is exactly why I always check it first professionally, and found a folder with 41 recordings in it, dated across 6 weeks. The earliest from the same week Diane first mentioned limiting visitors for stress, the latest recorded on July 1st, one day before Diane says our mother could no longer speak clearly. I pressed play on the last one. My mother's voice filled the room, weak, dry, but unmistakably hers. "Marin, if you ever find this," she said, and then there was a long pause, a rustle of fabric, the distant sound of a hospital monitor. "I've been trying to call you. I don't understand why you don't answer. I asked Diane to bring the phone closer. She said your line was busy. I'm scared, sweetheart. I don't feel like myself when they give me the medicine. I don't remember what I signed. The recording cut off there. 14 seconds. My mother, alone, drugged, frightened, and utterly certain, wrongly, that I had simply stopped picking up. I sat on that floor for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what that moment felt like, because I think it's the moment that changed everything for me, more than any legal document or bank record ever could. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was grief with the shape of a betrayal cut into it. The specific, devastating realization that my mother had spent her final weeks afraid, confused and alone in a room my sister had made sure I couldn't get into, believing I had abandoned her when the truth was the opposite. I went back to the beginning of the folder after that, forcing myself to listen in order instead of skipping to the end. The earliest memo, dated the same week Diane first mentioned limiting visitors for stress, was almost mundane. My mother narrating her lunch, complaining about the hospital gelatin, asking an aide, off mic, what day it was. It was the ordinariness of it that undid me a little. She hadn't known in that first memo that anything was being taken from her yet. By the 10th recording 2 weeks later, her voice had changed, slower, more effortful. Marin, sweetheart, I called twice today, she said in one. I don't know why you're not picking up. I hope you're not upset with me about something. I had to stop the recording there and press my palm flat against the floor. Because I remembered that exact week. I had called Diane 4 times asking for an update, and each time she'd told me our mother was sleeping. By the 20th memo, there was a new detail I hadn't expected, my mother mentioning the notary, confused about why the papers kept coming back to sign. Diane says it's the same form again, something with the bank, she said, her words dragging at the edges. I signed something today. I don't remember what. I sat with that sentence longer than any other. I don't remember what. Not because she didn't care. Because she couldn't. I played the recordings in order after that, one after another, until the sun came up. By the time I reached the 14-second memo again, the last one, the room had gone from dark to gray to pale gold outside my window, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical exactly what I was going to do next. I didn't confront Diane the next morning. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been the easy thing to do, and it would have accomplished nothing except giving her the chance to explain it away, the way she'd explained away every single warning sign for months. Instead, I did what I do for a living. I built a case. The first thing I did was authenticate the recordings myself, professionally, using the same forensic tools I use every day at the lab, verifying the file metadata, the creation timestamps, confirming they hadn't been altered or backdated, cross-referencing the device ID against my mother's known phone. I didn't trust my own emotional read on this. I wanted something that would hold up to a skeptic, because I knew Diane would be exactly that. I called a colleague, a forensic examiner I've worked alongside for years named Priya, and asked her to run an independent verification on the files, a second, neutral set of eyes, someone with no stake in my family and no reason to see anything but what the data actually showed. She confirmed what I already suspected. The memos were unaltered, the timestamps consistent, the device logs matching the dates Diane herself had cited for hospital stays and signing appointments. Then I requested my mother's hospital records from the admission Diane had never told me about, the one I only learned of secondhand at a barbecue. It took 2 weeks and a formal request as next of kin, but the chart came back with a note from an attending physician, dated the same day as the signing. Patient exhibiting intermittent confusion and disorientation, likely related to medication dosage. Family present. Family present. Singular family member, unnamed in the note, but I knew who'd been in that room. I pulled the phone company's call log next, the kind of record most people don't think to request, but that exists quietly in the background of every account. It showed 11 missed calls from my mother's number to mine across the final 2 weeks of her life. Calls I'd never received, never seen, never had the chance to answer, because somewhere between her phone and mine, someone had made sure they never went through. I laid it all out on my kitchen table one night. My table, not Diane's. No legal pad with numbers pulled from thin air. The memo transcripts, the metadata report, the hospital note, the call log. 4 separate, independent sources, none of them mine to fabricate, none of them able to be waved away with a phrase like, "Don't make this weird." I didn't act with anger. I want that understood clearly. I sat at that table and I felt something settle in me instead. Not fury, but resolve, quiet and complete, the kind of certainty that comes after a long, disorienting fog finally clears. There was one more piece I needed, and it was the one I was most careful about, because I didn't want to ambush anyone or force a confrontation that would feel like an attack rather than a search for truth. I reached out to the hospice facility and requested a copy of the visitor log, the same one that had once, quietly, listed only Diane's name as approved. And I called the hospice nurse who'd been present most often during my mother's final weeks. A woman named Carol, gentle-voiced, the kind of person who'd clearly cared for hundreds of dying patients and still hadn't lost the ability to be moved by any of them. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I only asked if she remembered my mother and whether she'd be willing to speak with our family's attorney if it came to that. There was a long pause on the line before Carol answered. "I remember your mother very well," she said quietly. She used to ask about her other daughter almost every shift. She was worried you'd stopped visiting. I always told her I was sure that wasn't true. I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment before I could speak again. She knew. Someone outside my family knew the truth the whole time, and she'd been carrying it, unspoken, because no one had ever asked her directly. I thanked Carol, and I asked her one more question, whether she'd be willing to attend a mediation session, if my attorney requested it, simply to share what she remembered. She said yes without hesitation. I hired an estate attorney the following week, a calm, precise woman named Elena Torres who specialized in undue influence cases. And I handed her the folder, memo transcripts, forensic authentication, hospital records, call logs, and Carol's willingness to speak. Elena read through it all in near silence, occasionally nodding, and when she finally looked up at me, she said something I've held on to since. "This isn't a case built on suspicion, Marin. This is a case built on evidence. That's a very different thing to walk into a room with." I didn't tell Diane any of this was happening. That was deliberate. I kept answering her calls the same way I always had. Kept my voice level and unremarkable because I understood, professionally, instinctively, that the moment she suspected I had proof, she'd have time to build a counter-story, the way she'd built every story before it. So I waited. I let Elena file the necessary requests quietly. Let the hospital records arrive through proper channels. Let Priya's forensic report get notarized and sealed without a single hint of it reaching my sister's side of the family. There was a strange calm in that waiting period, the kind I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't lying awake wondering if I was the unreasonable one. For the first time since March 14th, I felt like I was standing on solid ground instead of shifting sand, and I understood, finally, that the ground had been there underneath me the whole time. I'd just been too doubtful of myself to notice it. Mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early September, in a small conference room with a long table, soft lighting, and the particular hush that rooms designed for difficult conversations always seem to have. Diane arrived with her own attorney, poised, dressed the way she always dresses for anything she considers a performance. Sharp navy blazer, hair done, the practiced softness in her eyes that I'd once mistaken, for years, for genuine warmth. I sat across from her with Elena beside me. I didn't say anything at first. I let Elena open with the basics, the purpose of the meeting, the documents on the table, the intention to resolve the estate dispute without a prolonged court battle if possible. Diane's attorney spoke about the signed will, the power of attorney, the notarized documents, framing them the way I'd expected, clean, official, unimpeachable on paper. Then Elena slid the folder across the table. "We have forensically authenticated voice recordings from Ruth Cole's phone," she said, her voice even, unhurried. 41 recordings across a 6-week period, independently verified by a second examiner. We also have hospital documentation noting confusion and disorientation on the exact date the power of attorney was signed. And we have phone records showing 11 calls from Ruth's number to Marin's that were never received. I watched something shift in Diane's face. Not collapse. Not yet, but a flicker. The first crack I'd seen in months of practiced composure. "This is a private family matter," Diane said, her voice climbing slightly. "You had no right to go digging through Mom's old phone like some kind of investigation." "I didn't dig," I said quietly. It was the first thing I'd said in the room, and I made myself say it calmly, evenly, the way I'd promised myself I would. I restored a backup because I wanted to hear her voice one more time. What I found wasn't something I went looking for, Diane. It was something you tried to make sure I'd never hear. The room was silent for a moment. Then, almost as if the universe had decided the truth needed one more witness before this could end, there was a soft knock at the door. Carol stepped in. She'd been asked to wait in an adjoining room in case her account was needed, and Elena had quietly called her in once the conversation reached this point. Diane's face went pale when she saw her. "Carol can speak to Ruth's state of mind during the period in question, if the room is willing to hear it," Elena said. Diane's attorney glanced at his client. Diane said nothing. Carol spoke plainly, without embellishment, the way people do when they're simply telling the truth and don't need to dress it up. She described a patient who was frequently disoriented on medication, who repeatedly asked why her other daughter hadn't visited, who seemed frightened of something she couldn't fully articulate near the end. "I want to be fair," Carol added, glancing briefly at Diane, not unkindly. "I don't know everything that happened outside that room. I only know what I saw inside it. And what I saw was a woman who did not seem to fully understand what she was being asked to sign." Diane didn't cry, not the practiced kind of tears I'd watched at the funeral. She sat very still, staring at the folder on the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost its earlier edge entirely. "I thought I was protecting her," she said. "I thought if you knew how bad it was, you'd try to take over, and I couldn't. I needed to be the one who mattered to her at the end. I needed that. It wasn't quite a confession. It wasn't quite an apology either. But it was the truest thing I'd heard my sister say in 6 months, and for a moment, the anger I'd been carrying softened into something closer to sorrow. For her, for what she'd let herself become in her fear of not being enough, and for our mother, who deserved better from both of us in that room. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. This was never about winning, I remember thinking. It was about making sure the truth existed somewhere outside of Diane's version of it. There was a long silence after Diane spoke, the kind of silence that seems to physically change the temperature of a room. Diane's attorney finally cleared his throat and asked for a short recess to confer privately with his client. Elena agreed, and Carol quietly excused herself back to the adjoining room, giving Diane and me, for just a moment, the closest thing to a private moment we'd had in months. "I loved her," Diane said quietly, not looking at me. "I know you think I didn't. I know how this looks." "I don't think you didn't love her," I said, and I meant it, even then. "I think you were so afraid of not being the one who mattered most that you stopped letting her make her own choices. That's not love, Diane. That's fear wearing love's clothes." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. Her silence told me everything the legal pad full of numbers never could. The mediation concluded without a full settlement that day, but the direction was already clear. Within 6 weeks, with the evidence Elena had assembled, the probate court overturned the will and the power of attorney on the grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. The estate was redistributed according to Ruth's documented original wishes, the ones she'd stated clearly in healthier months. Before any of this began, wishes that split things fairly between her daughters, exactly as she'd always said she wanted. Diane didn't face criminal charges. I never wanted that, and honestly, I don't think the facts fully supported it. Isolation and pressure are not the same as outright forgery, and the law, appropriately, drew that distinction. But something else happened that mattered more to our family than any court ruling. Word moved quietly among relatives the way it always does, and the aunt who'd once told me, "That's just how Diane is," efficient, stopped defending her. Old family friends grew distant. The version of Diane as the responsible daughter who'd simply handled things quietly gave way to a truer, harder picture, and she had to live inside that new reality without anyone rescuing her from it. I didn't destroy my sister. I want to be honest about that, too. I simply stopped letting her rewrite what had actually happened, and once the rewriting stopped, the truth did the rest of the work on its own. It's been almost a year now since that mediation room. I still have my mother's old phone, cracked screen and all, sitting in a drawer I open on purpose now instead of by accident. I listen to one memo a year, on the anniversary of her death, and only one. Not because the others don't matter, but because I think my mother would want most of those weeks left where she left them, private. Hers, not turned into evidence anymore now that the evidence has done its job. Diane and I speak occasionally, carefully. It isn't warm, not yet, maybe not ever again the way it once was. But it's honest, and honest is more than we had for the 6 weeks that mattered most. I think in her own way, she's still working out how she became someone who could stand in a room and guide her dying mother's hand toward a signature line. I don't know if she'll ever fully answer that question for herself. That work isn't mine to do for her. What I know is this: I sleep now. I didn't for a long time, not really. Not through those months of doubting myself, wondering if I was the suspicious one, the difficult one, the daughter who made her mother's death about paperwork instead of love. I know now that documenting the truth was never the opposite of love. It was the only way love had left to reach my mother once she could no longer speak for herself. If there's a lesson in any of this, it isn't about revenge, and it was never about the house, or the watch, or the number on a legal pad. It's this: being needed by a dying parent and being trusted by them are not the same thing. And sometimes the people who insist loudest that they alone understood the truth are the ones working hardest to make sure no one else ever hears it. Keep records when people keep rewriting what happened. Not because you expect betrayal, but because the truth deserves somewhere safe to live, even after the person who lived it can no longer defend it herself. And trust the quiet, nagging feeling that something is wrong long before you have proof of it. That feeling is rarely paranoia. More often, it's the truth, arriving early and waiting patiently for the evidence to catch up. I still make coffee the same way every morning, dark roast, the brand she teased me into 11 years ago. I still keep the photo of us at the lake on my fridge, her laughing so hard her eyes are shut, my hair a wet mess. Some Sundays, out of habit more than sadness now, I catch myself reaching for my phone at 10 in the morning before I remember there's no one on the other end anymore. But I've started filling that hour with something else. I volunteer now, once a month, at the same hospice facility where Carol still works, sitting with patients whose families live too far away to visit as often as they'd like, reading to them the way my mother once read to me. Not because the plot matters, but because a familiar voice is its own kind of medicine. Carol likes to joke that I finally found a use for all that Sunday morning listening practice. I think about my mother's list-making sometimes, the way she'd narrate ordinary tasks like they were lessons worth teaching. I think she'd have narrated this whole ordeal the same way if she could have. Now watch this part closely, sweetheart. This is the part where you find out that being loved out loud isn't the same as being loved honestly. My mother's voice is still in that drawer. Still real, still hers. No longer contested. No longer buried under someone else's version of events. And once a year, for 14 seconds, I get to hear her say my name, and know that she was heard, and that she was believed exactly as she deserved to be.